Jumbo, welcome. We're so glad that you're joining us here on Black Power Media. You are participating in and watching Operation Power, a voice for Black radical political change and revolutionary change here on our station. We come to you each Thursday at this time, and we're glad that you're with us. My name is Inez Barron, and I'm here with my co-host, my husband of today 43 years of marriage. We're celebrating. And he is bold, he is outspoken, he is indomitable, he's one of a kind, the only unbought and unbossed
Charles Barron. I made it, y'all. 43 years.
43.
Oh my gosh. And I tell you, it's been the blessings of my life. And I'm honored, humbly honored to be here with the bold, the stunningly beautiful and brilliant mind, the most intelligent mind, Inez Barron.
Thank you so much. We're here again. We've got an exciting topic today. We're going to be talking about the government shutdown, the failure of the two-party capitalist system. And we've got an exciting, informative, well-versed author as our special guest, Dr. Gerald Horne. He'll be joining us shortly. But first, we do want to start our program with a libation. We understand that where we are today is not of our own doing, that we have ancestors who've gone before us, many whose names we don't know, many contributions that we're not familiar with, but nonetheless, they have gone before us and brought us to this part and passed the baton to us. So we do have a video that we want to share with you that honors our ancestors.
For African people, nothing important happens without a libation. And so for this very important presentation, we begin by the pouring of libation. We pour libation first to our first ancestor, to that hidden one who, though hidden, manifests in all things as all things, that God-goddess idea in the universe by any and all names. To our first ancestor, we pour libation, Ashe. We pour libation too to our ancestors because they were the first people on this planet, mothers and fathers of all mankind, flashpoint of the human family. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to our ancestors because they were the ones who first gave birth to the idea of civilization, knew we would need a form of governance, and they nurtured that idea along the Nile until it reached its zenith in Kemet. There they built these gigantic monuments as evidence of that great civilization, and they carved instructions on the walls of temples and tombs for us, so we would never forget. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to our ancestors because over time they put together all the tenets of civilization and they took those ideas and left the continent. They were the people of the first Exodus. They left Africa and went all over the world and peopled the world. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. We pour libation too to our ancestors because they did not sit on their laurels. They continued to improve, continued to evolve, and at each point of evolution, they again would leave the continent and settle and resettle the planet. They met themselves coming and going. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to those ancestors because over time, they found themselves the object of a forced exodus when they were kidnapped, shackled, cargoed, shipped out of Africa and enslaved in diasporas around the world. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to the ancestors left at home, the very young, the aged, the infirm, left to reinvent themselves, depleted of us, human resources. But they were enjoined by us in the diasporas, both objects of a global myopia that ruptured the soul of a people as it ravaged a continent. To those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. Pour libation too to those ancestors because over time they began to remember who and what they were. Because no matter where they had been dropped off, they still retained bits and pieces of who and what they were. They retained that African core that described them. They began to remember bits and pieces of a song. They began to remember lines from a rhythm. They began to remember dances that they did in ancient times. They began to remember those ancient drum beats that they now beat out on bare skin. And so to those ancestors, we pour libation, Ashe. pour a libation too to them because they then began to teach each other. They began to resurrect and reconstruct that history and that culture. They became the new Africans wherever they were. They became the new teachers, preachers, archaeologists, the new singers, dancers, the new drummers, the new Jaliyah. They reconstructed that history and our culture and became new Africans everywhere. So to those ancestors, we pour libation. Ashe.
Ashe. Ashe.
Ashe.
Asheo.
Aseo.
Thank you so much. Our engineer is doing such a great job. We want to give him a shout out.
Shout out.
Jikuru,
Kiru.
all the work that he does behind the scenes. Once again, you're listening to Operation Power, a voice for Black radical revolution and revolutionary change, Black radical politics and revolutionary change. And we are excited to be here with you. And we want to give you a little bit of background of who we are, Operation Power. So we have a very brief clip talking about who we are, what we've done, how we got started, and some of the things we've accomplished. So we'll share that with you, and then we'll be right back.
Operation Power stands for people organizing and working for empowerment and respect.
Operation Power is a grassroots social justice organization founded by local community stakeholders, which includes activists, organizers, and leaders who understand that the system as it is currently structured is destroying us and our communities.
The system, the capitalist system, one that promotes human greed over human need, one that promotes profit over people, needs to be dismantled. These local community organizers recognize capitalism needs to be destroyed and replaced with socialism.
Operation Power was founded in 1997 with the understanding that uprooting capitalism needs to begin locally. Operation Power understood that our communities are the perfect vehicle to dismantle this parasitic capitalist system brick by brick, and the economic, political, and cultural institutions and other systems in place in our local community infrastructure.
Thank you so much. And as a part of Operation Power, we do have some literature that has been written by some of our local people here, and we want to share that information with you. You have the book, Speaking Truth to Power, written by none other than Charles Barron, and it's a compilation of articles and lectures that have been given. We also have the book, It's Not You, It's Capitalism, written by Malika Jabali, and it's a primer as well as an in-depth analysis of what the economic system is here that's oppressing our people. And we have another book that we're going to share with you. This was a novel written by Kevin Barron, and it's called Black Rising. It's a page turner. Once you start it, you won't put it down. We want to encourage you to get it. And it's a part of a trilogy. And the second book in this part of the trilogy is called Black Rising, Home and Abroad. It continues the story which began in the first level. And the third book in the trilogy is called The Threat by Kevin Barron as well. And we do encourage you to go online to Barnes & Noble, and you can order these books online. Well, here we are. Our topic again is the government shutdown, which is now in its first day of being reopened. And it's saying the failure of the two-party capitalist system, the Democrats and the Republicans, two of the same, how they have failed our people and gotten us to this point, and how we, the common people, are suffering. You know, those people in Washington who are making the laws and determining that this is shut down, they didn't lose pay.
No pay.
They didn't have to make any of those sacrifices, you know, so perhaps they need to be the first ones to get cut.
That's right.
So that we can get a resolution to this in a more timely fashion, or not even get to this stage. And that's a part of what we're going to talk about. But we do have some quotes that we want to share with you as we kick this program off. And they're quotes by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Oftentimes people call him the peaceful warrior and talk about him and keep him boxed in and have him locked in time and have him just as a one person, you know, peace, turn the other cheek. But we have some quotes from Dr. Martin Luther King, and we'd like to share them with you now. And these are not contiguous quotes, but things that he has said that we put together that we want to share. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad. We must also realize that the problems of official injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. We must further recognize the ghetto is a domestic colony. Black people must develop programs that will aid in the transfer of power and wealth into the residents of the ghetto so that they may in reality control their own destiny. This is the meaning of new politics. Another quote, capitalism does not permit an even flow of economic resources. With this system, a small privileged few are rich beyond conscious, and almost all others are doomed to be poor at some level. That's the way the system works. And since we know that the system will not change the rules, we are going to have to change the system. Dr. Martin Luther King.
That is revolution. Dr. King, while in 1963 he had a dream and was talking about integration, by 1967, his dream turned to a nightmare and he began to talk about revolution. So today we want to focus on this failing capitalist system. That's why we have Dr. Gerald Horne with us, and in the context of this shutdown. Now, just to look very closely at what's happening with this capitalist system. First, it's a $7.1 trillion federal budget. You heard what I said, $7.1 trillion. There should be no poverty, no unemployment, no unhoused people, nobody starving. We shouldn't even be on SNAP. We shouldn't need SNAP in the first place. Secondly, there's a $37 trillion debt. This is a debtor nation. Now, what on God's earth did they spend $37 trillion on? We sure didn't benefit from it. So it's a debtor nation. So as we look at this capitalist system and its structure, we know that that annual budget is presented to Congress every February. The fiscal year for the federal government is October 1st to September 30th. So in February of that particular year, the president presents the budget for the next fiscal year to Congress. Congress then gets into debates. If they don't resolve or solve or pass that budget of 12 appropriation bills by September 30th, then they have to do what they call a CR, a continuing resolution. That continuing resolution is usually negotiated by the two parties, and in that, it's a temporary arrangement to fund parts of the government until they can get more time to negotiate. And oftentimes in that temporary CR, there are cuts, there are things not included. Like in this particular one, the battle was between the duopoly, the two failing parties. The Republicans said, we are not even going to negotiate with you Democrats, and no, we're not going to continue the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare. Those subsidies would have helped the struggling working class with paying the premium that they shouldn't have been paying in the first place. It was the Democrats, when they had all three branches of government, Barack Obama, they had the Senate, and they had the House. And they were supposed to pass Medicare for all, John Conya's bill, where the government would have been paying for the health care of the citizens, the 300 plus million citizens of America. Cuba does it. Venezuela does it. Zimbabwe does it. So many countries across the world that are less rich than America are able to provide free health care. So Obama said, I couldn't get that. So what I'm going to do is try to fight for a public option. They didn't even pass that. So the Affordable Care Act had the privatized health care delivery companies laughing their way to the bank. They were making billions. So this time around, the subsidies for Obamacare runs out in December. And the Republicans said, we're not even going to include that in it. The Democrats said, well, we're not going to pass it until the cowardice chumps of the state Senate or federal Senate passed it. And 8 or 9 of them decided they're going to cave in, just like Chuck Schumer caved in the last time. So these continuing resolutions, it was passed, and now people are going to have a real problem paying their health care. And this will continue only to January 1st, and they'll go at it again. Now, there's a history of shutdown when these CRs don't pass. This one was for 45 days. Trump, 45 days. Trump's last time in office, it was for 35 days. And then Obama was in, and it was 16 days shutdown. And then Clinton had a 21-day shutdown. And then there were about 7 other times that there's a shutdown. And when it's shut down, nobody gets paid. The government can actually not have to kick out any money. Other countries don't have government shutdowns because what they do when the bills are not passed on a timely fashion, they automatically keep the prior budget going. So that's what the shutdown is all about. Capitalism, even when it is up and running, is exploitative to our communities. We shouldn't need SNAP. We shouldn't need welfare. We should, in the richest country in the world, we shouldn't have double-digit unemployment, double-digit poverty. So these two party systems of the colonial capitalist system are pathetic. And that's why many people are calling for revolution, radical systemic change. And our guest can say it better than all of us because Inez is going to introduce him right now.
Our guest this evening, we're so delighted to have him on with us, is Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a historian, he's a professor, he's an author of nearly 40 F-40, F-O-R-T-Y books. He holds degrees from Princeton, from Columbia, and from the University of California at Berkeley. And he is the chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's also a contributing editor of Political Affairs magazine, and he has written more than 100 scholarly articles and reviews. His most recent book, or his upcoming book, he can tell us about it. I think it's called The Counter-Revolution of 1893. He can talk about it as we go on further. But we're so pleased to have with us at this time Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, Dr. Horne is a good friend of ours, and he wrote that counter-revolutionary book a while ago. I know he has the, I dare say, look, that's what you often say. When I saw the title of that book, I said, that's Gerald Horne, because he often says, I dare say. I think that's one of your latest books. But Dr. Horne, I appreciate our friendship and camaraderie over the decades. He's not just a scholar, he's an activist scholar. He gets down in our community with our issues. So I just wanted you to open it up with talking about this shutdown stuff, the two-party system, and give our listeners and viewers a perspective on why capitalism is such a failure.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, we may have a replay of what we just experienced over the last 45 days, because the way things are evolving as we speak is that in January 2026, there's a possibility of another shutdown, believe it or not. And let me also say that I wholly endorse your proposal for radical transformation, revolution, if you like. Obviously, it's going to be a long march, but we should begin now because, as the saying goes, a march of 1,000 miles begins with one step.
Yeah, that's right.
And in that context, let me encourage you, Charles Barron, to throw your hat in the ring against Senator Chucklehead Schumer. And let me encourage you, Inez Barron, to throw your head wrap into the ring against the man popularly known as Apex Shakur, aka Hakeem Jeffries. Of course, he has that name because of being a compliant tool of the Zionist lobby,
Yes.
which is wholly inconsistent with his responsibilities in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And of course, if you can rustle up a third person, I would urge a challenge to Congressman Meek Gregory. He calls himself Gregory Meeks, but I think that that's an inversion. That he's actually Meek Gregory. Of course, he's been a major opponent, believe it or not, of the government of South Africa. And so he's helped to prepare the way for Mr. Trump and his privileging the admission of so-called Afrikaners as immigrants, as he's cut the immigrant rolls for just about everybody else. And I dare say, that if you choose to follow that path, you would get substantial support, because obviously the Trump regime is in severe difficulty, is ducking and dodging, seeking to deflect attention away from this Epstein scandal.
Right.
When he threatened to invade Nigeria, guns a-blazing, just a few days ago. I saw it as a clear attempt to satisfy his so-called white Christian nationalist base, which is in an uproar, and there's a MAGA civil war that's unfolding because of the fact that Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News, had a softball interview with Nick Fuentes, who you may recall is from the Hitler's cool faction of the Republican Party. And obviously that has split the ranks of MAGA, since MAGA also has a Zionist faction led by billionaires such as Miriam Adelson, who also contributes heavily to the campaign of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. And so that is good news that they're at each other's throats, because if they're at each other's throats, it makes it more difficult for them to be at our throats. And similarly, there is upset within the Democratic Party because of the Gang of Eight folding on their demands concerning the lockdown. And there is question as to what they got in return for that particular sellout, because one expects that if there's going to be a sellout, that there'll at least be formidable concessions that can be pointed to. I guess the only thing that they can say is that they somehow underestimated the steadfastness of the Trump regime. He's willing to see people go hungry, deprived of their food stamps, their SNAP benefits. He's willing to see people's health care benefits be slashed, for example, in order to push through further tax cuts for the billionaires. But let me also say that as we begin this long march that you have sketched, we should also recognize the formidable barriers that we'll face. One, in your backyard, which is that in Staten Island, which is the headquarters not only of the NYPD, New York Police Department, but also the settler descendant working class, Italian Americans, Irish Americans. They tend to vote like the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which is the headquarters of the 1%. That is to say, the 1% not only of New York, but of the United States, if not the world. And if we're serious, including our friends on the left, or if they're serious, then they're going to have to address that problematic of the Staten Island question. Because basically, you just outlined how many of these benefits were designed to benefit the working class. And of course, in Staten Island, they're willing to turn away benefits in order to pursue this alliance, if you like, with the 1%. And I think also we're going to have to keep putting pressure on the incoming City Hall administration, because already we've received disturbing news that the incoming mayor will reappoint Jessica Tisch, a card-carrying member of the 1%, as police commissioner. And if that mistake is executed, it not only helps to solidify this unfortunate alliance between Staten Island working class folks and Staten Island cops and the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
That's right.
It's going to be difficult to make advance and progress as long as that coalition remains intact and unchallenged. So we have our work cut out for us. However, I remain confident that we'll attain our goals.
I couldn't agree with you more. And, you know, originally, here's two great things that has come out of this year's electoral process. One, we established, and you know the December 12th movement very well, Omawale Clay, and as a matter of fact, you were at the sister's place recently. We have what we're calling the Black Solidarity Coalition. This is the first time that the Nation of Islam, UNIA, our organization, Operation Power, Simotep, Dr. James McIntosh, the Uhuru Movement, Brother Omali Yeshutela, and a bunch of powerful, radical, youthful groups. We're coming together to say the way we can deal with Zoran Mamdani, because he's moving so far to neoliberalism that it's embarrassing, to the point that you shouldn't even mention the word socialism in his name in the same breath. Because in addition to Tisch, he also supported the City of Yes, which is a whole policy that Adams put forward to benefit the developers and take power away from the city council in determining things. And he's also said that Cuba and Venezuela's presidents were dictators. Socialist countries, he's calling Maduro and Chanel dictators because a conservative Latino group told him to do that. So he's really someone we backed away from supporting when we saw him making these moves. But you know, one of our biggest challenges, Dr. Horne, is neo-colonialism. And you mentioned a few of those puppets of the Democratic Party, Hakeem and Greg Meeks and Tish James and Eric Adams. There's just so many of them. Dr. Nkrumah wrote that book, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. Could you speak more on that conflict, that battle we have with the neo-colonial puppets of the Democratic Party?
So in Africa, which was what Dr. Nkrumah was primarily addressing, there was the independence of Ghana in 1957. There was the Year of Africa in 1960, when a number of African nations came to independence. There was 1963, when that pattern was recreated, culminating with Kenyan independence in December 1963. But what Dr. Nkrumah noticed was that even though the political reins of power were passed, the economics, the economy, the commanding heights of the economy continued to reside disproportionately in London, in Paris, and in Washington. And interestingly enough, if you look at the situation in the United States of America, we had that titanic struggle against U.S. apartheid, against U.S. Jim Crow. You could make a number of signposts alongst the road to forcing pushback against that system of evil. But one would be the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Another would be the Voting Rights Act of 1965, now on the verge of being gutted. But what happened, as I've tried to point out in a number of works, is that once again, there were unfortunate compromises that were effectuated in order to reach those milestones. Our mass organizations, speaking of the NAACP, for example, made a devil's bargain to throw overboard the left wing of our movement, led by the late, great Paul Robeson, it's rather shocking in retrospect how craven the NAACP was in their attacks on Robeson. And interestingly enough, as I pointed out in my book on Southern Africa, they tried to export that kind of devil's bargain to South Africa. They tried to get the ANC to go down a similar road. And so this has meant that as the left wing of this plane that we're trying to attain liftoff with was damaged, oftentimes damaged beyond repair, it's become difficult for the entire plane to gain liftoff, not least because in the pilot's chair or leaders like Eric Adams, who are utterly corrupt, who are willing to sell us out for a pittance, if you like. Right. And I'm glad you raised Sematap, because I hope that Sematap is following what our tax dollars are being devoted to. That is to say, that on PBS, public broadcasting, the next few days, a taxpayer-supported documentary series on the so-called American Revolution will be unfolding, which the filmmaker Ken Burns has said that 1776 was the greatest event in world history since the birth of Jesus, some 2,000 years ago. Now, apparently, when he consulted scholars, they did not apprise him of the fact that with 1776, you had an exponential increase in the number of enslaved Africans from the thousands in the late 18th century to the millions by 1860, 1861 on the verge of the US Civil War, not to mention the mass dispossession of the indigenous population. And of course, those two issues, land and labor, after you strip away all of the rhetoric about liberty and all the rest, it's land and labor, like any other dramatic event that was at the heart of the revolt against British rule. And so we're paying for this. We're paying to be defamed. And that's why we have organizations like Sematop, because I think that it's going to require a multi-front struggle, political struggle, a cultural struggle, an economic struggle. And this program is also part of that struggle, as well as Sematop is part of that struggle.
Well, you know, I think you raised a critical point. I think it was the great South African freedom fighter, Steve Biko, who said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So it's the information that we can get to our people to make them believe that revolution can, must, and will happen, to make them believe that this monster called capitalism and its powerful empire, all empires rise and fall, and they never stay forever, but they convince us of their invincibility. So if you can speak a little bit about the fall of this American empire and global capitalism, particularly in light of the rise of the Sahel Revolution and the BRICS countries in the global community.
Well, first of all, you are correct to suggest that empires come and go. Recall the mighty British Empire. One of the reasons why there are so many in Nigeria who speak English, Pakistan and India who speak English, and Hong Kong and Malaysia who speak English, and the Caribbean who speak English, it's part of the residue of the mighty British Empire. And then, or the once mighty British Empire, I should say. And then there's the so-called Ottoman Empire, the Turks, who ruled a good deal of North Africa and West Asia, influence all along the so-called Barbary coast from Morocco to Egypt, not to mention into historic Palestine, into Saudi Arabia, for example. And it collapsed about 100 or so years ago. And already we see an indication of the impending collapse of US imperialism. And I find it almost shocking and stunning that there's not much discourse about this. Because it's going to have monumental and maximum impact. You mentioned the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, for example, which, as we speak, they're developing alternative payment systems. That is to say that already Russia and China, instead of conducting trade in the US dollar, they conduct trades in their own currency. Already, you see with the COP30 meeting in Brazil that's unfolding as we speak, the meeting about climate heating, that China is dominating what is probably one of the most important technologies of the future, speaking of renewable energies. In fact, there was a story in the press the other day about Jamaica in the wake of Hurricane Melissa, where Jamaicans who had solar panels, their electricity was not interrupted, and neighbors were flocking to their homes to charge their phones, for example. Whereas if you were on the grid, you were out of luck. Likewise, it's interesting in terms of another key technology of the future, speaking of artificial intelligence, which, when allied with robotization, bids fair to eliminate many jobs. It's already eliminating jobs. Look at the layoffs at Amazon and UPS of late. And of course, this holds particular jeopardy for the Black working class. And I trust and I hope that Black union leaders are paying attention. But Jensen Huang, who is the leader of NVIDIA, which manufactures the chips that go into artificial intelligence computers, it's a $5 trillion corporation. He is on record as saying that China has already won the battle for artificial intelligence. And recall that it was Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia, who said that whoever dominates artificial intelligence ultimately would dominate the world. And so all of these trends are taking place. And once again, I mentioned how comrades like yourselves, you need to challenge these politicians like AIPAC Shakur, for example. But we also need challenges with regard to the leadership of our mass organizations, particularly the NAACP. If we feel that it's out of the question to challenge the leaders, then we should develop an alternative, just like BRICS has tried to develop an alternative to imperialism. But we can't go on like this, where you have an organization like the NAACP, which is asleep at the switch as these monumental changes are sweeping the globe, and they're acting like we're still in 1958. I mean, it's lunacy.
And, you know, you can also put in that formula the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus. Half of them are getting AIPAC money. Now, talk about them a bit.
Well, let's start in New York City, for example.
That's right.
Where you have, in many ways, the headquarters of global Zionism. And I think that it's not accidental that the global Zionist movement has been full-throated in their denunciation of recent changes in New York City politically, even though, as you suggest, the changes are not as radical as perhaps some have made them out to be. But from their point of view, they're significant, not least because the incoming mayor has threatened to detain Benjamin Netanyahu if he sets foot in New York City. By the way, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has said the same thing, that if Netanyahu lands in Ottawa or Toronto or Montreal, he will be detained, for example. I think that the Zionist movement has made serious blunders if their goal was to continue to retain influence. I think that this wedding, this marriage to Christian Zionism was obviously flawed from the inception. And it also is a flaw that they oftentimes attack to their left. When Elon Musk, rather notoriously, I'm speaking of the man who's in line for $1 trillion payout, believe it or not.
Wow.
Which, of course, I'm still waiting for an outcry from working class Staten Island about that, although I'm not going to hold my breath. But when at a political conference some months ago, he gave a Nazi salute. the Zionist lobby came to its defense, for example. Whereas if you say something that Benjamin Netanyahu finds unpleasant, for example, that genocide is unfolding in historic Palestine, the Zionist lobby will call for your head. And so obviously they've miscalculated in terms of the correlation of forces, which we should all understand and recognize if we're plotting strategy. That is to say, what is the strength of the right? What is the strength of the left? Knowing that in terms of suppressing our community in particular, we have to pay attention to the strength of the right. I would argue and suggest that the Zionists, if they were clear-eyed, would likely do the same thing, but they're so enmeshed in their class status. The fact that they are dominated by billionaires like Miriam Adelson, aforementioned, like Bill Ackman, who claims that he was responsible for the sacking of the first Black president of Harvard University, Claudia Gay, of Haitian immigrant descent, for example. He's not proceeding in a way that will guarantee the ultimate survival of the community he purports to represent and purports to speak for. I guess he's just so enamored with the idea of being a billionaire and feels that the right wing will not tax his misbegotten wealth. And that's what he's focused on. Although somebody should tell him that in order to enjoy that misbegotten wealth, he has to live and survive in the first instance. Obviously, that very simple fact has escaped him.
You know what I think is really fearful of the colonial capitalist system here in America. There are 48.5 million Black people, African people in America. And of that 48.5 million, in some of the major cities like our New York City, there's 2.2 million Black people and 2.3 million Latino people, a million Asian people. So the challenge for us is to deal with state power. In all revolutions, they dealt with state power. You mentioned Osagyefo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah in 57, right after the Bandung Conference in 1955. Then came Ghana in 1957, then Patrice Lumumba in the Congo in 1960, Mandela in Algeria, and Julius Nyerere. So all of that happened at that time, but that those counter-revolutionary forces were able to get back in power. But now you see the rise of the Sahel revolution, and it's not just Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, but Togo and a few others. That rise is going to help us in the belly of this beast because it's the same kind of enemy. Could you speak to that?
Well, I gave a broadcast just last night you can find on YouTube that dealt in no small measure with that latter point. And let me warn and caution the folks in our audience that right now, the Sahel regimes are under severe threat. Mali is under a blockade by Al-Qaeda. Recall that Mr. Trump just enjoyed a visit of Mr. al-Jilani, now called al-Shara, the de facto leader of Syria, who was formerly a commander in Al-Qaeda. I would not be surprised at all if there was discussion of destabilizing these regimes through Mr. al-Shara's networks, because we know as well that in Sudan, not far distant from the Sahel regimes, there is an unfolding bitter and bloody conflict with one side, the so-called Rapid Support Forces, backed by the Gulf monarchs, led by the United Arab Emirates. And what I tried to focus the audience on last night, and I'll reiterate to a degree tonight, is that we really need more focus on some of these corrupt Gulf monarchs. For example, Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, will be in the White House as of Monday or Tuesday, for example. I would not be surprised at all if this question of destabilizing the Sahel is on the agenda. And it's interesting that, as noted, Mr. Trump talked about going into Nigeria with guns ablazing because of alleged attacks on Christians. And yet al-Sharaa of Syria, his specialty was blowing up Christian churches. That's one of the ways in which he came to power in Syria. So obviously, Mr. Trump, as we already knew, is an utter hypocrite. But what we also need to recognize is that if these reactionaries who call themselves Muslims are able to destabilize the regime in Bamako, Mali, that it probably won't be contained there. It'll have knock-on effects in Liberia, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Togo, perhaps Ghana, for example. And so Mr. Trump and his comrades in this religious zealotry movement, obviously they're not concerned. I mean, we already know that Mr. Trump considers Africa to be comprised of so-called S-hole nations. We already know that he's boycotting the Group of 20 meeting in South Africa that's going to be unfolding shortly. And of course, I'm afraid to say that those in Southeast Queens should be pointing the finger of accusation at their congressman, Meek Gregory, or Gregory Meeks as he calls himself, because he has been, as noted, one of the sternest and staunchest critics of the ANC government. In some ways, has paved the way for Mr. Trump, for example. So I would just like to reiterate that we have a very difficult path ahead, but that's the nature of struggle. I mean, it's not going to be easy, but it will be triumphant.
Yes. And I think what you just said is key. It will be triumphant. I think the American empire is in an irreversible path of destruction and downfall. I don't think there's anything they're going to do. I mean, they are going to be dangerous. Like, speak of the Sahel, when we see that Ibrahim Traore and Simeon Gota and Tchani and the three most powerful countries, they are defeating a lot of the terrorism. And it's incredible how the Africa man that Obama built more military bases in Africa than any other president. And Obama and Hillary murdered with NATO Muammar Gaddafi, and Al-Qaeda and all of them were, rising up in Iraq and all of these places. But I think the thing that you just said, that we will be triumphant, is because when I saw what they came at Ibrahim Traore, they came at him like 22 times to assassinate him. And he's beaten back some of the so-called terrorism, because that seems to be the buzzword now. We got to stop communism years ago, and now we got to stop terrorism. And the very imperialist nations give birth to the terrorists, and then bring in the military to stop the terrorists that they gave birth to.
Well, clearly, I mean, excuse me for chuckling, but it's obviously perversely ironic that supposedly they're fighting terrorism when they're in bed with terrorists.
That's right.
Look at al-Sharaa. Look at the MPF. Look at Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's not accidental that on September 11, 2001, 15 of the accused hijackers, of the 19 accused hijackers, were actually of Saudi origin. Now, you would have thought that as a result, the United States would have attacked Saudi Arabia. But instead it attacked Iraq, which was also perversely ironic.
Exactly.
I should mention something else. I'm working on a book as we speak about slavery in Northern and Eastern Africa after slavery was abolished in the United States in 1865. One of the points I'm making is I think our movement in the 19th century made a strategic blunder when they did not go after slavery that existed after our chains were broken. I begin the book in the 1870s with Confederate officers, that is to say, officers of the vanquished Confederate States of America that tried to overthrow the US government in order to perpetuate enslavement of Africans forevermore. They flock en masse to Cairo, where they then lead an expeditionary force into Abyssinia, Ethiopia, not only for purposes of conquest, but for purposes of enslavement. And one of the criticisms I'm making of some of these regimes is they have a mania. They have an anti-Blackness mania, and they have mania for enslaving darker skinned people. Recall that after the overthrow of Gaddafi 14 to 15 years ago, almost instantaneously, what arose in the wake of his cruel and savage murder was enslavement of darker skinned people.
That's right. That's right.
Saudi Arabia had enslavement up through a good deal of the 20th century. In fact, when the Saudi leaders visited Washington, D.C. in the 1950s, believe it or not, they were likely accompanied by Nubian enslaved men, for example. And I'm going to be canvassing the press to see if there was any sort of outcry in the Black community about this. Although somehow I tend to doubt it, but we shall find out. And I think that as long as we allow this sort of backwardness to prevail, and it's prevailing to this very day, there's still enslavement of darker skinned people in Mauritania, just north of Senegal, for example. We all know that historically Morocco, which by the way carries the dubious honor of being the longest standing ally of the United States of America, signing a treaty in the 1780s, that Morocco was also a spearhead of the trans-Saharan African slave trade, of course, which really victimized Senegal in particular. And so these forces have not been ultimately defeated to this very day, which is one of the reasons why they're now encircling Bamako. They have their eyes on Ouagadougou and Niamey, that is to say Burkina Faso and Niger. And so as long as we have our popular organizations like the NAACP, which acts like the United States is the world, and that we shouldn't be paying attention to anything beyond these borders, well, that's a self-defeating strategy, because obviously Mr. Trump gains momentum. He and his comrades gain momentum by these global alliances with reactionaries, which then comes back to haunt us. But since our organizations, and oftentimes our politicians, and even our intellectuals, are not paying attention, they're leaving our community terribly exposed.
You know, you critically mentioned, and what's often left out in history, we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, or I call it slave raid because they raided us, but the Arab slave raid that started in the 1600s and was far more deadly, went to the Middle East, across the Red Sea, and that is hardly ever spoken of because we're focusing on the transatlantic slave trade. So I think those two slave trades are very, very important. I think it's critical that these things are being not talked about, particularly the Arab slave trade. And once our people begin to realize that the resistance movements in both of those trades, they're going to see why, what you said, we will be triumphant, even though these times immediately look, very dangerous, but also the Sahel countries, they have increased, and the BRICS, I think 20 other nations have joined now, Cuba, Burkina Faso, just a whole bunch of nations. Now, there's a lot of contradictions within those countries, and they are talking about unit as the new currency. So I think coupled with what you're saying about what's happening in that Muslim world, that Arab world, is the enlightenment that's occurring with some of these countries that are rising up now.
Well, you mentioned this trans-Saharan slave trade, for example. Actually, in many ways, it stretches well before the 1500s when the transatlantic slave trade begins to accelerate. And as I will point out in this book I just mentioned, just sketched, which will probably be published in the fall of 2027, during this particular period, you have people we would now call Black Americans. We were commodities, of course, we were chattel. And so we could easily end up in Turkey, for example, the headquarters of the empire, the Ottoman Empire, or we could end up in Egypt. As a matter of fact, Muhammad Ali, who will be one of the characters, not the boxer, but the Egyptian leader from the early 1800s up until the 1840s, he used to conduct slave raids into neighboring Sudan on a regular basis, for example. And you also had repetitive visits from slave traders in Dixie who would buy Africans in Cairo or in Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast and drag them kicking and screaming across the Atlantic. And so in many ways, we're talking about an international trade, a perfidious international trade, and that perfidy still exists to this very day, as represented by these recent visits to the Oval Office.
Incredible.
They're not hiding it. I guess that they feel that our movement is so enmeshed in attention that they don't have to hide anything, because they figured that we won't pay attention. It reminds me of my basketball days when there were some people you would say self-check. You don't have to guard them on the court because they're totally incompetent, for example. So you just let them do whatever they want because you know they're not going to score. They're not going to make an assist. They're not going to pass. Well, in some ways, many of our intellectuals, our politicians, our organizational leaders, they're self-check. You don't have to pay attention to them because they're not going to score.
That's right. Well, you know what? We have about 5 minutes left. I want to do this to end on a very positive note, because it seems that the American empire is on the decline. Trump has lost his mind, and he's talking about annexing, Greenland, taking Canada and the Gulf of Mexico. It should be the Gulf of America and the Panama Canal. All of that is a sign of his decline. And all over the world, the global South is outdoing the global North. The G7 is no longer as powerful as the Sahel, and the global South is more powerful, is gaining more power than the global North, although they're still very powerful. So we in the belly of the beast here. We building this movement in New York. We're very confident within the next 5 to 10 years that we're going to be able to build a Black radical electoral politics movement that could match the Democratic Socialists of America, the Working Families Party, and the Democratic Party, because that's how they get elected in New York. Inez and I were able to beat that machine in East New York, and now it's time for us to bring that across the nation with our National Black Radical Political Convention. And next year it's going to be in New York, and I want to invite you to be one of our keynote speakers on that question. But can you just end it with a positive note on what you see that's exciting and a great, as the Chinese say, crises is a time of opportunity?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Be sure to email me because my schedule already is filling up for 2026. And
oh, yes, I will.
I would like to add this, but I hope I'm not premature. But as I look at the crisis in the Caribbean with the Secretary of War, Hegseth, bombing ships on the unproven premise that they're carrying drugs, with nuclear submarines creeping ever closer to Caracas, with the aircraft carrier Gerald Horne, which contains many fighter jets creeping ever closer to Venezuela, I'm heartened by a number of facts that may suggest that Mr. Trump is bluffing. And if he is bluffing, this will be an indicator of the correlation of forces, which I already have made reference to. It suggests that he's all bark and no bite. And I think that as he assesses the situation in Venezuela, when he sees that mass mobilization, when he sees that neighboring Colombia, not to mention the guerrilla movements in Colombia, have pledged to intervene on the side of the Maduro regime. Both the French media and the Wall Street Journal have suggested that the Maduro regime is coup-proof, because I think that Mr. Trump expected that the unsheathing of this sword would cause a coup in Caracas. But apparently that's not happening, not least because Cuban intelligence, which is one of the top intelligence agencies on planet Earth, plays an instrumental role in Caracas, because the Cubans know that if they're able to dislodge Maduro, they will be next in line. And so I hope that I'm not being premature in suggesting that Mr. Trump may be in the process of being unveiled as a bluff, as a person who bluffs, who seeks to rattle his saber in order to intimidate. In fact, that's straight from The Art of the Deal, where he suggests, he does it all the time. I mean, he tried it with China, for example, but China metaphorically punched him in the nose when they circumscribed the export of rare earth minerals necessary for the manufacture of fighter jets, smartphones, computers, sophisticated automobiles, for example. And Mr. Trump had to fold. He had to throw in his hand. And of course, China is punishing the U.S. further by not carrying through on their pledge to buy more soybeans, which is going to harm its agricultural base in the U.S. Midwest. And so let me add one more point, which I would hope that the new occupant of City Hall will pay attention to. Mayor Johnson of Chicago has gone to the United Nations and has suggested that there be a human rights investigation of the United Nations. We need other mayors to endorse what Mayor Johnson has done, starting with New York, adding Karen Bass in Los Angeles, adding the African American Mayors Association, which represents about 48 million people, believe it or not, because we know that historically, because of the often adverse correlation of forces we face domestically, reference what I said about Staten Island, where you have these traitors to the working class who are part of the working class living in profusion. Because of that sort of treason on their part, we've had to rely on international factors, which is, of course, where the NAACP falls short, where Pete Gregory falls short, where AIPAC Shakur falls short.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Horne. This has been an abundance of knowledge and information that you've given up, and inspiration. And we always say our struggle may be long, but our victory is certain. We will win. Inez?
Thank you so much, Dr. Horne, for being our special guest. You've enlightened us. You've given us much to think about. We know that your next book is going to be great. Someone said, you have making us wait another year and a half, but we remind them that there are 39 other books that they can read as they wait for the one that's coming. And certainly we agree with you. The struggle may be long, as Charles often says, but the victory is certain.
And as we say when we end our programs, and we definitely, I always, every chance I get, I say, Dr. Horne, could you come on the show? Could you come on? And he so graciously said, not this time, but eventually, you know, we catch up to each other and have a long history with this brother. He's more than a scholar. He's an activist, a revolutionary. So we say at the end of all of our programs, the truth shall set you free, and power is the great equalizer. Black power.
Black power.